You were never meant to hear this, but now you have, and something inside you knows. There's no turning back. Beneath the hills of eastern Oregon, hidden in the folds of forgotten maps and rotted soil, lies a truth that was never buried, only silenced. Between 1852 and 1888, more than 800 settlers vanished in a 20-mile stretch of the Oregon Trail. The official records speak of disease, misadventure, starvation, but records lie, graves whisper. At the center of this orchestrated vanishing stood a small wooden chapel called Sacred Heart, its steeple piercing the fog like a needle through flesh. It was no sanctuary, it was a trap, baited with scripture, masked in compassion. The family who ran it weren't preachers, they were harvesters, and what they reaped were souls. The Graysons, Morai, Constance, and Ezekiel didn't just murder, they perfected it. They transformed Christian charity into psychological warfare, masking arsenic in salvation, hiding death behind a smile. This wasn't chaos, it was system, structure, strategy. Each grave, a ledger entry, each death, a calculated asset. No one came for the victims, no law, no church, no cavalry, because the Graysons had perfected something far more chilling than murder. They built trust. And when trust becomes a weapon, the devil doesn't need to hide, he just needs to kneel beside you and pray. Keep watching, you've just stepped into the void, and what comes next rewires the way you see the world. It always began the same way. A broken wagon, a sick child, a dying wife, and then like a miracle, the Graysons appeared, as if summoned. Father Morai, with his silver tongue and hollow eyes, offered prayer and shelter. Sister Constance, warm and soft-spoken, offered her remedies. And Brother Ezekiel, he was the fixer. He'd mend your wheel, feed your oxen, and dig your grave. These weren't random killings. No. The Graysons selected families like a banker selects investments, measuring risk, reward, and timing. They targeted the exhausted, the isolated, the devout. Their formula was simple. Offer hope, poison trust, and absorb everything of value. Possessions, gold, livestock, and often children. But their brilliance wasn't just in the kill, it was in the delay, the slow unraveling. Arsenic in trace doses, administered over days, symptoms mimicking dysentery or typhoid, trail illnesses no one questioned. And by the time death came, survivors were too grief-stricken or sick to suspect, too grateful for a Christian burial to realize they'd walked into a slaughterhouse. And that chapel basement? It wasn't just for supplies, it was a chamber of silence, a place where suffering echoed off stone, where children cried for parents who'd already been buried, where Morai read scripture while cataloguing the belongings of the dead. Not all evil is loud, some of it whispers, some of it prays with you, while it poisons your children. In 1854, 2 years after the Morrison family vanished, the deaths had become routine, and that's what made it dangerous. Routine is where evil thrives unnoticed. The Graysons no longer feared discovery, they were celebrated. Local settlers praised them as saints in the wilderness. They baptized babies, buried the dead, donated food to homesteads and hosted Sunday services. They weaved themselves into the spiritual fabric of Eastern Oregon, not as outliers, but as pillars. And yet beneath the hymns and hospitality, they operated like a dark syndicate, religious in appearance, ruthless in execution. Father Morai had begun documenting every transaction in a thick leather-bound journal. Each entry catalogued names, ages, items seized, and which family member died first. It was bookkeeping soaked in blood, and according to one recovered volume, the Graysons believed they were purifying the trail, cleansing it of unworthy stock. Sister Constance once wrote, "The Lord does not delight in the weak. He sends them to us that we might carry out his mercy." But mercy, to them, was a scalpel. Even the land began to reflect their work. A stretch of trail that once echoed with laughter and wheels became a corridor of ghosts. Oxen refused to pass. Horses grew skittish. Travelers whispered of shadowy figures watching from tree lines, of hymns sung in the wind with no one around. This wasn't just murder, it was ritual, and the Graysons believed they were chosen. You still think this is just history? In the fall of 1858, a young preacher named Elias Kerrigan passed through the region with his new bride. He'd heard whispers of the Sacred Heart Chapel and its saintly caretakers. He was eager to meet Father Morai, to break bread with a man he'd heard spoken of like a prophet. He never made it home. Kerrigan's journal, recovered decades later from beneath a floorboard in an abandoned cabin, revealed something chilling. He'd begun to notice inconsistencies, contradictions between scripture and Morai's teachings, references to cleansing, to blood as sacrifice. Morai didn't speak like a missionary, he spoke like a judge. But Kerrigan's wife, Sarah, had taken ill the second day. Sister Constance began her treatments immediately, the blessed teas, the prayers over the body. Within 48 hours, Sarah was unconscious. Kerrigan begged to take her east for help, but Morai warned him, to run from the Lord's test is to fail it. By day 4, Sarah was dead, and so was Elias, but not from poison. He was found in the basement, wrists slit, back slumped against the chapel wall, blood congealed into the shape of a crude cross. A suicide, the Graysons claimed. But that wasn't his blood. Elias's body was found without a single incision, no wound, no blade, just a contorted expression of horror, and eyes missing from his skull. Something else was happening in that basement, The Sacred Heart Chapel wasn't built for prayer, it was built for control. Its architecture hid more than a basement. Beneath the foundation was a subchamber, a crawl space sealed with river stones and timber beams blackened by smoke. Survivors, decades later, described symbols carved into the walls, primitive, circular, repeating. Some believed they were Nordic runes. Others said they resembled early Christian iconography, twisted into something unholy. But one truth became clear. The Graysons weren't just murdering for profit, they were performing acts of transformation. What started as arsenic evolved into something more precise. Datura root, belladonna, monk's hood, the deadliest herbs, carefully administered not to kill instantly, but to fracture the mind. The victims didn't just die. They hallucinated, they screamed scripture backward, they clawed at their own skin, and Father Morai documented it all. One entry reads, Samuel Hargraves spoke in tongues for 17 minutes before death. He saw his mother, he saw fire, he begged for darkness. The dosage was correct. This wasn't healing, this wasn't faith, this was psychological experimentation masked in pastoral robes, mind control before the term ever existed, and yet, no one investigated. Why? Because power protects power, and what the Graysons did, the institutions learned from. Hospitals, schools, churches, courts, places you're told to trust, where obedience is nurtured and questions are discouraged. What if Sacred Heart was just the first model? By 1862, the Graysons had perfected their operation into something terrifyingly efficient. They no longer waited for sick travelers, they created the sickness. They poisoned water barrels, tainted flour with powdered root, laced blankets with crushed nightshade, and offered them as gifts. The families who accepted, who trusted, were marked. Those who didn't, they disappeared by nightfall. The surrounding land became known as the Dead Stretch. No wagon trains stopped there anymore, but not because they knew the truth, because the fear had seeped into the soil, because people began to speak of visions. Ghosts on horseback, children walking the trail with their eyes sewn shut, a man in black robes standing on the chapel roof during lightning storms, arms raised to a sky that never answered. But what chilled even hardened bounty hunters and fur trappers was the realization that the Graysons had no exit strategy, no plan to run, no fear of justice. They operated as if protected, and maybe they were. Territorial records reveal a letter sent in 1864 by a U.S. Marshal named Devlin Ward. He described credible reports of systematic poisoning and burial in the hills east of the Blue Mountains. But his request for an investigation? Denied. The reply came from Washington. One sentence. Let the dead bury the dead. What did they know? What were they protecting? You've been taught that monsters hide in shadows. But the real ones? They get permits. They wear collars. They write laws. In 1867, a shipment of records from the Oregon Territorial Authority was misrouted to a San Francisco postal depot during a rail transition. Inside, incident reports, death registries, and handwritten letters referencing the Sacred Heart Chapel and the Grayson family. 42 pages of raw, unfiltered data. It was quietly reclassified and then buried. But one archivist, a man named Henry Dalton, made a copy. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't brave, he was just curious, and what he found cost him everything. Among the documents were death certificates that listed trail illness for dozens of families, all signed by Father Morai. Problem: Morai wasn't licensed. He wasn't even ordained. In fact, no church had any record of him. He wasn't a man of God. He was a ghost with a ledger. Worse yet, the ledger Dalton uncovered didn't just list victims. It included symbols, patterns, columns of data tracking how long the victims survived after each dose and how their behaviors changed. Behavioral notes on families, on children, on mental collapse. This wasn't murder for greed. This was early behavioral programming, conducted on the weak, the desperate, and the devout. And that same year, the first asylum in Oregon opened. Guess who sat on the advisory board? A man named Ezekiel M. Grayson. Same name, same signature, different town, same agenda. This isn't folklore. This is the foundation of modern control. By 1870, the Graysons had all but vanished. The chapel burned to the ground in what officials called a lightning fire, though no storm was recorded that week. No bodies were found, no graves disturbed, and yet, the disappearances stopped. On paper, it ended there, but in truth, it only evolved. 6 months later, a new sanctuary opened in Idaho Territory, the St. Mercier Institute for Wayward Youth, funded by unnamed benefactors, overseen by Reform clergy. No public affiliations, no denominational ties. But its head administrator, a man described in local papers as tall, severe, with eyes like cold ash. His name, Father M. Elias. Survivors, yes, survivors, would later describe rooms with no windows, chants recited in dead languages, and treatments meant to liberate the spirit from the flesh. Boys as young as 7 were subjected to isolation, starvation, and hallucinogens disguised as communion wafers. One patient escaped in 1874 and was found weeks later, barefoot and incoherent, muttering the same phrase again and again. He walks between the rooms, but not between the walls. This boy, Abraham Finch, was committed to the Oregon State Hospital, where he died 2 years later. His death certificate listed acute delusion and cardiac failure. The attending physician, Dr. E. Grayson. What you're witnessing isn't random evil, it's intergenerational refinement, a franchise of fear. The names change, the robes change, but the design, always the same. By 1888, every trace of the Grayson legacy had been erased from public record, census files deleted, land deeds reassigned, newspaper mentions scrubbed clean. It was as if they'd never existed. But what you erase leaves impressions. That same year, Congress quietly approved a federal land acquisition near the old trail site, not for restoration, but for testing and administrative expansion. The land was fenced off, guarded, and marked with a designation that didn't exist in public databases until 1947. Area 6, Behavioral Studies and Environmental Influence. Sound familiar? It should, because that same zone, decades later, would feed personnel into MK-Ultra, the CIA's secret mind control program, where hallucinogens, trauma, and psychological fragmentation were weaponized against civilians. The blueprint, almost identical to the Graysons' remedy schedule. But there's more. Declassified documents from 1979 reveal that the earliest MK-Ultra trials referenced frontier precedents. Test logs were named after Western outposts. One file was titled S.H.C. Protocol Alpha. Sacred, Heart, Chapel. They didn't bury the Graysons. They promoted them, turned the poison into policy, the ritual into research. You see it now, don't you? The same hands that held your grandmother's Bible now hold the screens in your pocket, the pills in your cabinet, the curriculum in your child's school. This is not about history. It's about inheritance. One final section remains. There's a reason you were never taught this. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was useful. The story of the Graysons wasn't a stain. It was a seed, a prototype of psychological dominion. Control disguised as compassion, authority draped in robes, power executed through trust. And what started on the Oregon Trail now lives everywhere, in sermons that preach obedience over truth, in medical regimes that numb but never heal, in media that keeps you afraid, distracted, and obedient. Look around you. Most men walk through life asleep, eyes open, hearts empty, spirits caged, but not you. Because now you've seen it, the way institutions colonize the human mind, how suffering is shaped into a product, and how men like Father Marai didn't disappear. They adapted. Today they wear suits, they run boards, they build apps, they write the textbooks your children read, and they still ask for your trust. But now you know better. You've seen the roots, soaked in blood and scripture. You've traced the lineage, from poison tea to televised propaganda. You are not asleep anymore. You are not innocent, and innocence was never protection. If you've made it this far, comment it again, twice. I do not sleepwalk anymore. I do not sleepwalk anymore. Let the others scroll past, let them laugh, let them mock. But you just stepped out of the cave. Now, what will you do with the fire?